Monster by Walter Dean Myers. Steve Harmon is a 16-year-old boy awaiting trial for murder. The entire book is written out like a script with lines, stage directions, and settings. This is because Steve wants to be a filmmaker and is writing down everything that happens in trial like a screenplay. The incident takes place at a drugstore where a robbery was taking place, leading to the death of the owner, Mr. Nesbitt, by gunshot. It is said that two men named James King and Richard Bobo Evans were the ones who went in, robbed, and killed Mr. Nesbitt. Following was Steve and another young boy named Osvaldo Cruz as lookouts. The book pans between prison and the courtroom as Steve sits and talks about the horrors and violence that surrounds him while in jail. Oftentimes, he takes a look back at his childhood and ponders if this was always going to be his destiny. Many witnesses come to testify against the robbers in court, but none could properly be used against Steve because the witnesses were also criminals coming to try and reduce their sentences. There was actually no witnesses to the murder. At the trial, they dig deep into Osvaldo, the other lookout in this crime, and states that he only participated because he was scared of Bobo. In actuality, Osvaldo is a young gang member, meaning his fear of Bobo was out of the question. Bobo states that King and Steve knew each other and were told Steve was lookout. Bobo claims Steve gave a clear signal to him and King to enter the store, and the robbery and murder took place. However, Bobo never actually saw Steve that night and saw no signal. There was still a woman in the store during the robbery/murder, and she only saw two men that night, King and Bobo. In the end, the gun that Mr. Nesbitt was killed with was his own gun. King and Bobo entered the store and robbed and murdered Mr. Nesbitt with his gun. After the crime, the two men left to get dinner, with Steve not in sight. With not enough evidence, Steve is found not guilty. The title of his play is Monster, due to being called this in court for a crime he did not commit.
My section of the analysis was racism in history and racism today. African Americans have been oppressed by whites through Jim Crow laws, segregation, anti-interracial marriage laws, cartoons and minstrel shows, institutionalized racism, and privilege, along with being attacked. These things have led to and were the oppression of African Americans and their struggle for equality and equity. Along with this, regardless of age, both children and adults were attacked physically and verbally in discriminatory attacks and even killed in hate crimes. Unfortunately, the justice system has only recently gotten around to being slightly more fair, and so for far too long, these crimes and discriminatory actions often only received slaps on the wrist, if that. Though civil rights movements were beginning to make headway and would continue to do so. Racism today. Today, racism occurs in a system built on historical oppression and discrimination. Some examples of racism today include racial profiling, wherein African Americans are assumed suspicious because of their race, microaggression, such as jokes made at the expense of others, comments about appearance, speech, or behavior, and physical or verbal attacks. The Black Lives Matter, which is one movement occurring currently, is tackling the issue of police brutality towards Black people and how the police are often not punished for their actions, with people feeling unsafe even in their own homes.
The connection of the book to today. Social issues against African Americans brought about through the book Monster have remained prevalent in today's society. Throughout Steve Harmon's journey in prison, he was dehumanized, forced to let go of his aspirations and hope. He was treated as a guilty man before proven innocent. We see injustices in the judicial system today. We see racism and mistreatment, and we do not see much change. Instead of seeing himself as a person, Steve was only able to see himself as an inmate. Monster depicts the court systems as dehumanizing. As you read through the book, you see that they do not treat people in a just way. They treat them as if they are below the societal bar. Connection continued. A case from recent history. In the case of Mississippi versus Brown, 3 African American men were arrested for killing a white farmer. They were severely beaten until they confessed to the crime. A judge ruled this unconstitutional and paved the way for the Miranda rights. Like this case, Steve Harmon was arrested based on white individuals' words, who did not give an honest statement. They were arrested although there was no evidence linking them to the crime. Instead, they were arrested for just being African American. Like Steve, the three men from Mississippi versus Brown were discriminated against because of the color of their skin. Connection continued. Tim Cole, an African American man from Texas, died in prison in 2010 due to health issues that were preventable. He was ignored and mistreated and died from his illness. He was sentenced to prison because of the eyewitness who misidentified him. They had no forensic evidence connecting him to the crimes, but sentenced him anyway. Like Steve Harmon, there was no evidence suggesting he was involved in the robbery, but since a woman to the court who looked respectable and honest said it was him, they believed her. Unlike Tim Cole, Steve was released at the end of his trial and returned back to his family, receiving a better fate than Mr. Cole. Connection of the book to class. This class brings up a lot of these issues we see in both the book and life. Cesar Chavez believed that racism had a large impact on his thinking, that racism reflected organizational practices and policies of social institutions as well as personal attitudes. This relates to the novel immensely. Steve started to believe he was a criminal just by how everyone looked at him and treated him. This is what Cesar Chavez mentions, although the situations differ. Steve was subjected to racism, and he started to doubt himself and felt like he was the monster everyone made him out to be. Classroom connection continued. We need to educate our coming generations and our current generations to keep promoting equality. The voices of those oppressed should be heard, and without the people's voices and education, change cannot happen. When we first meet people, we try to get to know them. This is not always the case. Like in Steve Harmon's case, he was judged before anyone heard his story. He had no chance to defend himself or have a say in what was happening. Due to someone else lying in the court of law, he was subjected to racism, discrimination, and oppression for no other reason than he was of African American descent.
People of color, more specifically African American people, make up 13.4% of the United States population, yet make up 22% of fatal police shootings, 47% of wrongful conviction, exonerations, and 35% of people executed by the death penalty. Racial injustice has always been an issue in our justice system, but it feels like more recently, people are bringing it to light and trying to make a change. African American people are incarcerated at an alarming rate of 5 times the rate of white people. The school to prison pipeline has shown that there are higher rates of incarceration for African American juveniles than any other race. As of 2013, African American juveniles were 4 times more likely to be committed than white juveniles.
Connection to the book previous years. Connections to the book to previous years was far too many to count, mainly because it seems like things had changed a bit. That is not what it seems like. It seems like history repeats itself back to back. Recently, on November 23rd, 2021, a man named Kevin Strickland was finally set free after serving 43 years in prison after serving a crime he did not commit. Kevin was just 18 years old, arrested over a crime he did not do. Just like the book, there was an eyewitness, but in this case, the eyewitness was wrong. Kevin also had no physical evidence towards the crime. The only eyewitness in this crime previously recanted her statement before her death in 2015. In recent years, wrongly convicted Black men and women have been walking out of prison free. According in 2019, the annual report by National Registry of Wrongful Conviction is somewhat between 2.2% to 10% is the up-to-date data. But also keep in mind, all white juries and racial jury biases remain still there. In 2010, Equal Justice Intimate Study and Racial Jury Discrimination found the majority of the United States in the South, in a number of majority Black countries, all white or almost all white juries. Racially biases use of predominating strikes to eliminate qualified juries continued systematically to exclude African Americans and other minorities. Researchers suggest that racially diverse juries bring more reviews, spending more time deliberating and are less prone to mistakes.
Social justice can be defined as justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. In the United States, there is a long history of systems of oppression that can be directly related to race. In our education systems, we see that mostly white schools get an unfair advantage in funding. According to a report from eBuild done in 2016, a company that promotes equity in public schools, the average non-white school district receives 2,226 less than a white school district for every student enrolled. Schools that are underfunded have been proven to give a lesser quality of education, putting those students at a major disadvantage to those attending a white school. In addition to the difference in the education system, there is also a noticeable difference in the distribution of wealth between white and Black households. In 2019, the median Black household earned just 61 cents for every dollar of the income the median white household earned. This directly relates to the increase in poverty in the minority communities, again, putting those families at an extreme disadvantage.